Welcome to the Low Carb MD podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope.
As we have always said, we are bringing you medical information and cutting-edge science, but none of this is medical advice. Please seek out input from your own doctor.
So we're going to work on that.
This meeting is being recorded.
Hello and welcome back to the Low Carb MD podcast. This is a great one. We've already been talking before we got on live here, and it's great information. So Tro, we've outdone ourselves this time, and hopefully I can learn stuff from you two guys.
Look, I got to be honest with you. I've been looking forward to this for a number of years. Somebody who's very brilliant, challenged the way I've looked at cholesterol, challenged the way I've looked at evidence. We haven't always agreed, but that's okay, because I think we have a very high degree of mutual respect. I begged him to come on. I want to say it's been 2 years, and finally he's like, I will lower my standards for Brian and you, and I'll come on. If you haven't seen his CrossFit talks, if you haven't seen him lecture, we have the esteemed Dr. Dave Diamond, who's with us, a Ph.D. in neuroscience, an avid publisher on cholesterol, heart disease, lecture on cholesterol, heart disease. If you've been living under a rock, just type his name and type LDL and you'll get to his work. We're happy to have you here. Finally, it's been I know we've gone back and forth, but we got you here.
Thanks, Brian and Tro. It really is a pleasure to be here, after talking about this in the last couple of years.
Couple of years. It's been more than a couple of years. You've been attacking this at the least. I think I watched a lecture of you from you. I think your CrossFit lecture was like 2017, if I remember, or even earlier. That one I think had a massive impact, over 1 million downloads, or 1 million views. It's funny. I'm going to be brutally honest, okay? And Brian will tell me, when I first came into contact with you, I was like, who is this guy telling me that I don't have to worry about cholesterol, right? And then I'll tell you right now, I am like the staunchest supporter of you. Even though we may have minor disagreements, I think your voice is so important, especially in this age of cancel somebody, you're not an expert, you are an expert, and your message is so vital. Even if there's different nuances clinicians have to take, it challenges the way we interpret data, the mantras and the dogmas that medicine has took in. So I really think your voice is important, and I'm just delighted you're here.
Thanks so much. That's really kind of you, Tro. I meant by the last couple of years is, I don't seek out to do podcasts. I do them very rarely. And part of it is I'm not really looking to be in the spotlight. I have nothing to sell. I have no financial benefit to being on a podcast. And I kind of look at it, my talks and my papers should speak for themselves. But listen, sometimes I think it's important to get the message out there. So it's good after a couple of years of you asking me to be on that finally we're going to do it.
Yeah, and I have to say the same. I first heard, I go, who is this guy? What's he talking about? And, then I saw your lecture and I said, let me sit back and look at this thing. And then, I rolled across Ivor Cummins and all of these guys who are outside of medicine, who are contributing to science. And I go, these guys are like, they know their stuff. And also the courage. I mean, really, that's the thing that struck me, is like, okay, even if you're right, when you stand up against the machine and you stand up against the establishment and the egos and the arrogance of medicine, I was like, I respect someone like that, and I'm willing to listen at least and have an ear, and then say, okay, let's see what your background. So let people who don't know your background of being an anteater like myself from UC Irvine undergrad, and how that developed to have the courage to do what you have done over time.
Well, thank you, Brian. Perhaps it also helps that I'm one of the few academics. I mean, I have the highest regard for Ivor, as well as Dave Feldman. It's amazing you've got engineers who are outside of medicine who are making so much sense talking about heart disease and cholesterol. I'm sort of rare that, I'm an academic and I've got sort of the protection of having tenure at a university, sort of to stand out and say what I feel. So that does put me in a unique position. And I'm also in medicine in a sense Yeah, I'm a neuroscientist, and I often get this. What's a neuroscientist doing talking about heart disease, especially speaking out against American heart disease, their view on cholesterol, and some of the leaders in the field. So I think it would help for me to take a few minutes and just give you a little background as to how I got here. So we go back, Brian, we have in common UC Irvine. We both went there. I was there about 45 years ago as an undergrad. And my passion all my life has been biology. So I took biology at Irvine, got my degree in biology, then a PhD in biology with a specialty in neuroscience. And I just loved doing the neuroscience research. I thought the greatest challenge to my life would be to study the brain. And, I've had the great pleasure to be a neuroscientist. I've published over 150 papers, medical journals on the brain. For 30 years, I was a career scientist at the VA, and I think we did a lot of really good research to help people, especially veterans, with PTSD. And so that's been my career. And I want to also say I've gotten millions of dollars in research funding, not only from the government, but also the pharmaceuticals. And so I've done very well in working with pharmaceutical companies, getting the research, getting funding. And so I personally, as well as professionally, I really want to emphasize, I have nothing against research supported by the pharmaceuticals, as well as when individuals do promote their research. We should understand there can be a conflict of interest when the research is supported by a drug company. Myself, I have published papers that at first had to be approved by the drug companies before I could publish it. And any presentation I give has to be approved by the drug company. And I sign non-disclosure agreements that say the drug company has control over whatever it is that I talk about. And I sort of accept that. But that's just a part of it. Much of the research is funded by drug companies. So just get it out there. I have nothing against drugs in general, medications, nothing against pharmaceutical supported research. Where things changed for me and why we are here today was an important thing that happened in 1997. I had decided I wanted to get some life insurance. I had to get a blood test. In 1997, my blood test resulted in me getting an extremely high rate of life insurance. My trigs, my triglycerides were about 700, and my HDL was about 30. Okay, you do the math, we're looking at a ratio of like 20. And my ratio then, over the next few years, I figured it was an anomaly, wasn't real, stayed between 20 and 25. And, you guys should be alarmed. I don't know if you ever knew that that was my actual ratio. And any cardiologist hearing that would say, oh my God, the guy's on his deathbed. Because you really want that ratio to be 1-to-1, maybe 2-to-1. And I'm at 20-to-1, okay? And I knew a lot about the brain, but I didn't know much of anything about cholesterol, heart disease. And I had always sort of had this idea that low-fat diet was healthy. I didn't eat much meat. And I figured I'll just exercise more, continue my low-fat diet, eliminate red meat completely. And so for like the next 4 or 5 years, I'm working harder at losing weight and exercising and cutting back on the fat. I thought it was really great. I'm eating bread without the butter. And so all that happened was my triglycerides went up, my HDL went down, and I got fat. So I was never obese. I don't have sort of the before and after pictures that you have, Tro. Never diabetic, but I was about 25 pounds heavier than I am now. I had very little energy. Playing one set of tennis exhausted me. But I'm still looking at it that I'm going to work this through. And there's kind of a really important paper that I published that shows my ignorance. When you're a scientist, your paper's out there, it's there forever. I was convinced that fat would make you fat and make you unhealthy, and actually gave rats a high fat diet and combined it with chronic stress. And we actually published a paper that showed brain atrophy, specific atrophy of hippocampal neurons on these rats that were given a high fat diet with chronic stress. And I look back at that, and that was about 2005, and it showed how biased I was to think that it was eating fat was so unhealthy. Because what I didn't even bother, and this is something I'm embarrassed about, I didn't even bother to put in the methods that 25% of the diet was sugar. So it was a high fat, high sugar diet that actually worked with synergized with the stress to cause brain damage. So the findings and the methods are valid, but the philosophy was off. But around that time, and I'll remember this so clearly, my doctor had been monitoring my lipids year after year, and I just thought I could beat it. And by 2005, 2006, he sat me down, and just like the commercial for statins, he said, you've tried diet, you've done the exercise, and nothing has worked. I urge you, you've got to go on a statin, as well as some other medication to get your triglycerides down. And frankly, my triglycerides were so high that I didn't even get an LDL level because it's calculated based on triglycerides and other measures. So I didn't even know what my LDL was because my triglycerides were so high. Finally,
probably low, right? When the triglycerides are that high, we've seen that observation. LDL tends to be low. Very interesting.
You'd have to measure it directly because it can't be calculated, when triglycerides are that high. I mean, my blood test just simply said LDL can't be calculated. So yeah, it very well could be low if it had been directly measured. I remember I got back to my office and I said, what the hell are you doing? You got a degree in biology. The least you can do is read about, what's going on with your risk for heart disease. I mean, my doctor said basically, I'm extremely high risk for having a heart attack. Meanwhile, I'm paying that extremely high rate for life insurance at this time. And so I started reading about it, and I read a biochemistry textbook, and I saw excess carbohydrates, excess glucose converted to fat by the liver. It's an epiphany. It's like, here I am, so pleased I'm not eating fat and I'm eating bread and pasta, and potatoes. And that's really the source of my problem. I also read about people who have familial hypertriglyceridemia. And that's what I've got. I mean, that's why a subset of people, and it's estimated about 5% of people, can have astronomically high triglycerides. So it can go over 1,000 for some people. So I started cutting back on the carbs, but if you cut back on the carbs, well, what do you eat? And of course, at the time, I thought Atkins was a quack, and I thought low carb diet, was a fad. So I was faced with a problem. And over the next few years, I really started reading about low carb diet and realized the science was good and that it applied to me. So I cut back on the carbs. I realized I didn't need to be concerned about the meat. I needed to be concerned about the carbs. And it's an interesting thing that evolved. Being at a university, I started to realize that all this fear of fat wasn't justified. Fear of cholesterol, slowly I started to learn about this as I'm reading papers and I'm reading books. And I decided to make this into a seminar. And the university where I'm at, University of South Florida, permitted me to have a seminar for our pre-med students. And so I started lecturing on diet and cholesterol to the students. And then around 2010, and this for me, again, was just personal. I had no interest in sharing this with the outside world. Around 2010, the university invited me to give a talk to the public about what I had learned about cholesterol and diet, to which I just thought it was going to be a small group I would be presenting to the public. And I didn't know it'd be recorded and put on the internet. And it was. And the day after this talk went online, I'm looking at them thinking, wow, there are 100 views of my talk. And after a week, it was 1,000. And then grew to hundreds of thousands of views of this talk. And so people became aware of my views on cholesterol and diet. I got connected to some really outstanding clinician scientists. Around 2015, started publishing work. I've now published about a half dozen papers. I've been invited to give talks. And yeah, as you said, I've now got over 1 million views on my talks and podcasts. And so this is still something for me that's very personal. I have to be aware. It's so important for me not to consume carbs. I gain weight so incredibly easily. And I appreciate all the research that preceded my learning about this, because I'm absolutely convinced that if I had stayed with the low-fat diet, that I would be obese at this time. And if I hadn't learned all about it, and I'm sure I would be on the meds, I'd be on statins, I'd be on the other meds. So this is a personal crusade for me. And I get no financial reward for this. I just feel like I want to share what I have learned as a scientist with other people.
Can I talk about that? Because our podcast is 100% not for profit. We donate everything to charity. We don't take any commercials on this podcast. Me and Brian both took pay cuts. I have yet to pay myself a full salary yet. And I share your sentiment that it really is, and I know why you're saying it, because I see the fierce criticism from dogmatic doctors, and it's so unfounded. And I get the same thing, and Brian gets the same thing. And it's just not necessary. We know you're a man of conviction. We know you have no dog in the game. And we know you have strong opinions. And that's why you're here, because your voice is important. And we may disagree, and I may lob things your way and we'll see kind of how you think and how we all think differently. But even if we disagree on, which I don't think we do, I think 90% of stuff we agree on, I think you have a courageous voice. And so, I'm happy to have you here.
Thank you.
I'm sure you get a lot of crap every single day from standard cardiologists, and I see it online. It sucks. It sucks.
Well, let me add. I have worked and I published with cardiologists. The cardiologists that I think actually evaluate the medical literature, and they stand aside from what the dogma is.
Yeah.
I mean, we had a BMJ paper that had 5 cardiologists as co-authors. The one that I shared with you on hypercholesterolemia and diet recommendations. I'm now connected to some outstanding cardiologists, and yes, I've gotten a lot of crap from cardiologists who won't even read my papers because it conflicts with.
Oh, I find that hysterical. I find it hysterical when they say, "Well, I don't know what he's going to say." Well, I won't even read it. I've seen that, and it's a shame.
Yeah, one of them I think you actually did a podcast with. So
yeah, we may retract the podcast soon.
Yeah, we don't want to retract stuff very often, but there's a couple that I look back and go, you know what, it's a tough one. But I think either way, we have to hear all views. And if we're afraid of looking, if I was afraid of looking at your views, I would never consider it. When I heard about Dave Feldman and different people, you go, okay, let me look at this at least. Like when you say I'm not hearing it, I don't want to know. It's like, this is my religion. No one else can have a different religion than me, and I'm not going to hear it. So sometimes say, hey, I like a little about what they're saying. Maybe I'll apply this. Maybe this is practical in what I'm doing. But this mindset of censorship or saying you can't even question, like that's how science evolves, by questioning.
Right.
Well, they have faith.
You say we agree on 90%. Maybe by the time this is over, we'll agree on 100%. Because ultimately, I think the sticking point for you is concerns about high LDL. And so let's talk about LDL. Everybody, I mean, I kind of grew up with the idea that high cholesterol, clogs your arteries. And you'll actually even find that on websites. Even the WebMD website talks about cholesterol just clogging, sticking to your arteries. And the first thing people almost want to dismiss, everybody knows that people with familial hypercholesterolemia have high cholesterol, have high LDL, and they die at a high rate of heart disease as a result of the high LDL. And that's just dogma. And I find it interesting. People don't even want to talk about that because that's a given. And that's one of the first things I researched and I published papers on. And my conclusion, and this may surprise you, is that no, the people with high LDL, with familial hypercholesterolemia, and we're talking about people with total cholesterol of like 400 or 500 and LDL of like 250, which should basically be clogging arteries and killing people young, causing massive stroke. So I've just had the pleasure to work with Malcolm Kendrick and Ufi Ravenskov, Michelle Delargeril, and others. And we have scoured the literature on familial hypercholesterolemia. And the one thing I think it's important to understand, why do these people have high cholesterol? And you realize it's because they have a genetic anomaly in which the LDL receptor doesn't work very well. So it doesn't bind to LDL to essentially bring it into the cell, which is so important for cell health. And what does the liver do in response to this inefficient LDL receptor? It cranks up LDL production, cholesterol production, to offset the inefficiency of the LDL receptor. That just shows you how important cholesterol is. That's why these people have high cholesterol. And that's one thing. Now, if you look deeply into the literature, which is what I've done, When you look at the lifespan of people with FH, familial hypercholesterolemia, you find that they have a normal lifespan, that these people live into their 70s, 80s, and beyond. And this has been documented for decades. And what I find really interesting is there are statin advocates who have published this finding. John Castelline, who's the strongest statin advocate there is, published a paper in BMJ that explicitly found, doing a genealogical study, that the people in the 19th century who are very likely to have had FH, in fact, live longer than the general population. And the reason for that is that LDL is a part of our immune system. LDL works with the white blood cells. LDL actually helps to eliminate pathogens such as viruses and bacteria. And now let's look at the modern studies. And so there's a fantastic work, I believe it's out of Norway, in which they do genetic testing on people. They have the age of death of people and their health. And they look at people as they age. And what they find is, specifically after the age of 60, there's no increased rate of death overall, all-cause mortality, and no increased rate of death from heart disease. And in fact, at any age, there's no increased rate of death from stroke. And in fact, and this is remarkable, at 70 years of age, these people, we're not talking about any statin benefit, these people with extremely high cholesterol have a 40% lower rate of death compared to the general population with normal levels of cholesterol. And why is that? Because they have a normal rate of death from heart disease and a dramatically lower rate of death from cancer and infectious disease, because people with high cholesterol have a more efficient immune system. Now, it is the case, I'm not saying FH people don't die of heart disease. It is the case that in the first 50 to 60 years of life, people with FH do have more heart disease. They do have more death from heart disease. So this is kind of a paradox. How can it be that you have a higher rate of death with this observation in your first 50 to 60 years of life, and then somehow that is gone when you're in the prime time of life to die of a stroke or heart disease? Because majority of deaths from heart disease occur after people are 60. And so this is where we have scoured the literature. And this is really not well known. But when you look side by side at the people who die of heart disease with sky-high cholesterol, it's the subset of people that have hypercoagulation. It's the subset of people, along with high LDL, subset of people have sky-high, for example, fibrinogen, which is a clotting factor, where they have insufficient, what's called fibrinolysis, insufficient ability to break down clots. So when you look side by side in those papers in which people have measured clotting factors along with the LDL, what you find is the LDL is factored out. I mean, there's actually a really nice paper out of John Castelline's group that shows no difference in LDL in people with FH, but there is a difference in a secondary genetic anomaly, and that's a prothrombin gene. So there is a prothrombin allele. There's a prothrombin gene, a form that increases everyone's risk for heart disease, found in the general population, found in people with FH. And those people with FH that had this genetic anomaly for prothrombin without any difference in LDL, these are the people who had more than twice as much death from heart disease. So the first thing I would really like to address is the increased LDL is an adaptive response in these people. And it does not, there's no evidence that it actually causes heart disease. Now, let me add something. These people have increased susceptibility to die from secondary factors that you have in the general population. So everyone knows that smoking is a risk for heart disease. The FH people that smoke have a dramatically high incidence of death from heart disease. About more than half of them will die young of heart disease. When you look at the people with FH that don't smoke, it's an extremely low percentage of them that die of heart disease. Because smoking, one of the reasons why smoking is so hazardous is because it triggers coagulation. Smoking, high blood sugar, stress triggers coagulation. So when you've already got a subset of the people that have excess fibrinogen, excess factor VIII, of the other factors involved in the coagulation cascade, now you add smoking to that, and they're much more likely to die. Obviously, hypertension is related to killing people early. Okay, people dying of heart disease. The people with FH with hypertension are the ones that die at extremely high rate. And again, hypertension triggers coagulation. That's one of the mechanisms by which hypertension can cause premature death. When you look at the subset of people without hypertension, that don't smoke, that don't have diabetes, but they have high LDL, you see an absolutely normal lifespan. It factors out the LDL component.
And I think another that Kendrick was talking about also was sickle cell disease in young people with totally normal LDL cholesterol, having massive heart attacks, strokes, peripheral vascular disease, and amputations.
Right, that's in his book, very nice book, The Clot Thickens, which I would recommend to your audience. Really nice work in which, again, just a scientific approach from an MD, just asking the question, is cholesterol guilty? If you're on the jury, he provides the evidence and asks you, basically, do you want to convict cholesterol of causing heart disease, or are there other factors? And the book documents really well the involvement of coagulation factors, in a sense, in every level of heart disease, not just simply the final clot that blocks an artery, but it's there from the beginning.
So can I lob my first question that I have? And everything you're saying, I certainly agree with everything said so far. Excuse me. When you look at the population, thank you. When you look at the population-based data for LDL and all-cause mortality, I've looked at two sets of population, and I think it was Nordisgaard and Mortensen who put out some data in the past couple of years. When they plot out LDL and mortality, it's certainly not zero. That's the lowest mortality. It appears to be somewhere between around 140, right? And it's certainly not 200, and it's certainly not 50 or zero, which most cardiologists would say. So how do we interpret this? How do we interpret this? Is it can we learn anything about, where we'd want LDL to be? It's adaptive, you're saying. So how do I interpret this data? Or is it too heterogeneous? Like, hey, we can't make any sense of, what effect this has. And then if you look at people with heart disease and you do those same kind of population-based data, it looks like that, a LDL of 90 in those people is associated with the lowest all-cause mortality. So how should I interpret this in relation to kind of the data? And if you guys, just for the listener, go, to Current Opinions right now, if you haven't already gone to it, and look up his paper, Statin Therapy is Not Warranted for a Person with High LDL, because it has a plethora of data. But there's the first question. There's the lob at you. What should I do with this data?
So, great question. And clearly, when people have high LDL, your conventional cardiologist will tell them that this is going to cause them to have premature death from heart disease. As a coincidence, we were both presenting at Low Carb Boca not too long ago. You talked right before I did. And I think this is actually incredibly useful because you showed a study that's related to this. And it's called Mr. Fit. And Mr. Fit has been used to show, the findings of Mr. Fit have been used to show that people with high LDL or high cholesterol are going to die prematurely. And
low, right? So, and the low cholesterol died prematurely in that Mr. Fit.
Well, no, as I recall, it was just simply linear. The important thing that they pointed out in Mr. Fit was that there was a linear relation with any increase in, this is actually total cholesterol was Mr. Fit. And so it was clearly flawed. that they were saying total cholesterol. In this study, you had a few 100,000 middle-aged men, which they followed for about 7 years. Got their cholesterol levels, and this is total cholesterol, and just saw, well, who dies of heart disease after 7 years? So these men from 50s into their 60s. And the important thing about that study, which you showed, was that with each increment in cholesterol, you are much more likely to die of heart disease. And in fact, when you could look at the lowest to the highest cholesterol, you were 4 times more likely to die of heart disease compared to someone with low cholesterol. And the graph you showed is now routinely showed when people associate high cholesterol to increased heart disease. Now, I looked at that study, and in my talk, I showed not only that your graph was correct, and think about that, you got a 400% chance of dying compared to low cholesterol, but I showed the raw data, okay? And this is what's so important, because as I say it, and I've got a paper going out in which we look at it, cholesterol basically became too important to fail. It's kind of like the banks, in 2008. The American Heart Association was completely behind cholesterol as causing heart disease. So the studies really had to show high cholesterol killed people. That 400% increase in cholesterol. But if you look at the raw data, and I like to say the men in Mr. Fit were horribly uncooperative. Almost nobody died. Only about 1% of 350,000 men actually died of heart disease. And yet there's this 400% increase in death. If you look closely at the data, and this even includes the men who were not hypertensive, who were not smokers, so about half of them were neither hypertensive or smokers. If you look at the people who actually died, it's about 0.6% of the people with the highest cholesterol died. And the people who had the lowest cholesterol was about 0.15%. So you're talking about less than 1% of the people died. And the real difference between those with high cholesterol and low cholesterol for non-hypertensive, non-smokers was 0.45. Okay, but when you divide 0.6 into 0.15, you get 4. Okay, and that's how they come up with a 4 times greater risk of dying of heart disease. And so the statistics have been manipulated. And I published a paper with Luffy Ravenskov specifically on this, and we can get into the statins as well. So when you hear about death, all-cause death, you have to go to the raw data to see how it's amplified by using what's called relative risk. If you tell a patient you have cholesterol of 300, and you have 99% chance of not dying of heart disease, but I should put you on a statin anyway, that's a conflicting message. You're telling the patient you have less than 1 chance of dying with your cholesterol level. Should you fear that? And the answer is no. Of course, I'm not giving any medical advice. I'm just giving you statistics. But if you tell the patient you are 4 times more likely to die compared to someone with low cholesterol, well, of course, you take a statin. And there are empirical studies that have used those 2 numbers. And they've tested physicians as well as patients. And when the physician is told of the 4 times more likelihood of dying, then the physician wants to prescribe the statin. But those same physicians do not want to prescribe the statin when they're told the difference is less than 1% between those high and those low. And so what I would emphasize to you is, first, you've got to go to the raw data and really know what percentage of people are dying with high cholesterol. And second, it's almost as if I kind of look, God is playing games with us, okay? He has stuck in this red herring. The red herring is the high cholesterol. In a subset of people with high cholesterol, what you have is somehow linked. It may very well be genetically linked in a subset of people that they also have high clotting factors. So you've got to measure the person's clotting factors. And then it's not just clotting factors that'll kill you, because fibrinogen does not kill you by itself. It's when fibrinogen is activated such that it causes platelets then to aggregate. So fibrinogen by itself doesn't cause clots. It's got to be activated by something such as hypertension or high blood sugar. So again, to implicate LDL alone is not supported by the evidence.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's probably a multi-hit. You know, like if I, you know, and I'm sure Brian will say this, if I wanted to cause an MI, I would chain smoke, have hypertension, sleep, you know, not sleep at all for days, take an amphetamine, get stressed out, and you know, and maybe like inhale some cadmium, you know, from pea protein, you know. So that's what I do, because I'm with you. It's definitely a multi-hit, and then I'd mainline, you know, Skittles, right? So
Yeah, and you
Yeah.
and the other thing, as you brilliantly said in your that earlier study, when you didn't factor in the sugar component, right? So there's a lot of people who have high blood pressure. We see clearly when we lower the sugars down, we lower the insulin down, blood pressure normalizes on its own, taking away that big
Yeah,
risk factor. We're talking
absolutely.
about visceral fat. We're talking about all these pro-inflammatory stuff. So that's why, you know, when we start looking at data, it becomes very complicated, because us docs, in the back of our mind, with everything we do, we know we could end up in court one day. And
Yeah.
we have to sit there before a jury who doesn't understand the science, and a judge who doesn't understand the science, and a lot of people who, on the plaintiff side, who are going to cloud the issue as much as possible. And so that's that where we sit, you know. Let me just throw out as an example. I have a guy, he's 38 years old, of Indian descent, poorly controlled diabetes for years and years and years on a low fat diet, right? So this guy's triglycerides were through the roof. In the last year before he met me, he's lost 100 pounds. He's normalized his blood pressure. His A1C went from over 10 to 5, right? So he comes in, he goes, you know, doc, I want to get a coronary calcium score and see where I'm at. I just got it back this morning, 1,444 in a 38-year-old, right?
Hmm.
And so you go, yeah, okay, you're 38. We got a lot of years ahead of us. Now, could it be from all the old damage? Do I think in the last year, with losing 100 pounds, that he's caused all this high coronary calcium, right? If he had a 0 score, I feel a heck of a lot better about it, right? So it's one of those things when I see this information, as we kind of discussed before, you go, okay, now I got information that if I didn't have that information, I might be acting a lot differently. So, you know, how do I advise this patient?
well,
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I have the vantage point of an academic. I'm not responsible for someone else's life. I'm not giving advice to people. You're in the unenviable position that you're advising people as to what to do about their health every day, and you're potentially liable for giving advice that is seen as not following consensus. So I understand where you're coming from, and I actually think if we had had this podcast 20 years ago, your position would be indefensible if you had told this person not to be concerned. I assume you're saying you had high LDL as well.
Well,
Would you say that?
let me add another thing to that to make it even more fun. His LDL right now, 106, triglycerides 86 from over 400, right? His inflammatory marker. Now here's a confounder. Let me throw into the equation that sticks in the back of my brain. And I asked this question when we were in Boca, actually, but I don't think people grasp what I was saying. This person also had an mRNA intervention, right? And I know chronic inflammation is a problem. So if this person has recurrent chronic inflammation going on, hypercoagulable risk, right? And then you're gonna say, well, it wasn't that, it was the cholesterol that did it, of 106. That's where the confounding in real life becomes apparent, because I see CRPs elevated all the time now that I never saw in young, healthy people. And we're seeing bad outcomes in young, healthy people.
Yeah, it is interesting that it's very common. First of all, the people with diabetes tend to have low LDL, which people tend to ignore that because you're saying, well, it's the diabetes causing it. It's a good thing they don't have higher LDL or they die even younger. So let's just say hypothetically, well, actually, even at 106, people would say LDL should be almost 0. This is what the advocates will say. So 106 technically is not really all that high, but the emphasis is the recommendations are that it should be below 70, or even with the PCSK9 meds, they now want to see LDL below 50. I mean, I've even heard the PCSK9 advocates saying we want to get LDL to 0 because they view LDL as toxic. So yeah, you're faced with a problem. And sir, super high coronary calcium very well could have been from all the years in which he had terrible damaged metabolism. Now, related to coronary calcium, you're also faced with problems because I find that this is routine. When people get high coronary calcium, they're told to go on a statin. Just simply idea, whenever in doubt, recommend a statin. That just seems to be that's the default state for a cardiologist. I look at this as kind of a remarkable finding. It's now well established, this is not controversial, that statins appear to increase coronary calcium. I mean, the scores increase on people with statins compared to placebo. And that's beyond discussion. And everyone pretty much, they all also agree that high coronary calcium is the best predictor of future coronary events. So you got a problem. You got all these people that are recommended to take a statin, and statins increase coronary calcium. High coronary calcium is associated with increased risk of heart disease. So what these people have come up with, it's almost as like they all huddled up. I kind of imagine this. We got a problem. We know coronary calcium is bad. We know statins increase coronary calcium. What are we going to do about this? Well, let's make statin-induced increase in coronary calcium a beneficial thing. And this is now the way of thinking, that statins actually help to accumulate coronary calcium, which then stabilizes the plaque, which now makes it less likely you're going to have a plaque rupture. I mean, this is just ad-libbing to be able to turn an adverse effect into a benefit. There's absolutely no evidence that this increase in coronary calcium with a statin is beneficial. So, I mean, there's actually no evidence that it's harmful either. So we should show, talking about statins, and people like to demonize the statins. I've actually looked at it, and so that there's no evidence the increase in coronary calcium is harmful, but there's no evidence that it's beneficial. There is no reason to prescribe a statin simply because someone has high coronary calcium.
So,
Yeah, and I think the other, sorry, Troy, I just want to finish on this patient. So the other confounder, the problem I have, is it would be an easier decision for me from a legal standpoint, medical legal standpoint. That's not necessarily patient outcomes. But if this patient says, I'm not going to change my diet, I'm going to smoke and drink and eat whatever I want, they're going to have high LDL, I know they're going to have a bad outcome. So the statin drug is protecting me more than the patient, right? Because if they say, look, you knew this guy had an A1C of 11 and his LDL is high and you don't do anything about it. The problem is the other side of the coin is there's a ton of doctors, and I think this is the bigger problem. They're going to say, okay, statin drug. I'm not going to tell you to change life. And I see it all the time. And I know you see it, Tro, is that there's patients with that A1C of 9.5. They don't change the lifestyle and their blood pressure is high. And they go, you know what? We're going to put you on a statin. And then they go, I put them on a statin. I did what I could do, but they never talked about lifestyle or changing or getting sleep or, work on your stress levels or quitting smoking.
the path of least resistance.
It's the path of least resistance. You go, at least I did something, it's like throwing a little bit of fairy dust in the air. It's not doing anything for that patient because they have a massive chronic inflammation problem. So until we fix that problem, which we're discussing with a low carbohydrate, watching your stress, getting enough sleep, all these things, then all you could do when you have a 6-minute appointment is say, here's a statin. I checked the box. I did the right thing.
So let me say something that will surprise you. And this is why I've tried to convince people that our latest paper on why statin therapy is not necessary for someone with high LDL and a low carb diet. And it surprises me that there are cardiologists, one of whom you had on your podcast, who refuse to read our paper, is that we state explicitly there is a benefit, a substantial benefit of statins for the patient that you just stated. For the person with low HDL, high triglycerides, that person who basically says, I'm not changing my lifestyle. I'm not going to go low carb because I enjoy eating the crap that I'm eating. There is evidence that the statins will benefit that person dramatically. I mean, the difference for that kind of patient compared to the placebo is one of the largest that I've ever seen. We're talking about, there's a study, the reanalysis of the 4S study. 4S was a simvastatin study on people with secondary prevention for heart disease, originally published in 1994. This is incredibly important. People have criticized that study because it was basically run by a drug company, Merck. And they even, I mean, it's amazing. They analyzed the data. It was a Merck employee who analyzed the data. But we set that aside. And what they did was they looked at the people who were sort of like your patient, who basically were, think about them as diabetic and not changing their lifestyle compared to the people who are healthy with high LDL. So they had high HDL, low trigs. The difference is huge for the statin benefit, like 15%, and that's not exaggerated data, 15% difference in those treated versus untreated. Now, is it because they lowered the LDL? There's no reason to believe it's because they lowered the LDL. Statins have multiple effects independent of their cholesterol reduction. And one of, I think, the most powerful effects of statins is their anticoagulants. And they're anticoagulants in a way that's not completely understood. I mean, there are reviews out there, but I actually think statins are more effective as anticoagulants than some of the typical anticoagulant medications. I actually saw a paper in which people on statins in response to stress have actually less evidence of hypercoagulation. And stress clearly leads to heart disease through activation of coagulants. So for the people who don't want to change, and I'm not recommending statins, but I'm saying for the people like your patient, there's empirical evidence of benefit, which we put in our paper. As well, in elderly people in PROSPER, in which people were put on a statin, the people with extremely low HDL, and you're going to find that in people who have high blood sugar and who are sedentary, overweight, the people with extremely low HDL had a benefit, substantial benefit, these elderly people, from taking a statin. But the people with high HDL, which is typical of what you find in people on a low-carb diet, showed no benefit whatsoever. It's interesting to me that people have attacked my paper by saying, well, you haven't conducted a study on low-carb diet and statins, so therefore you're not justified in concluding there's no benefit. Or they say there isn't sufficient power. This is kind of interesting from a scientist. We conduct power analyses to do studies. And so when you look at that 4S study, for example, the huge benefit for the people with the low HDL, high trigs, had actually fewer subjects in which the statin had no benefit for the people with high HDL, low trigs. And they say, well, the study wasn't sufficiently powered to show no benefit. Well, this is post hoc rationalizing at its extreme. When we look at these studies, and the bottom line is showing a huge difference in benefit to those who are unhealthy versus those who are healthy, the clear prediction is that if you do all that your patients do, for example, how you've changed your life to go low carb and lose weight and improve your biomarkers, or your Indian patient who has improved his biomarkers, there's no evidence that a person with those biomarkers, which I mean, high HDL, low trigs, reducing your blood pressure, there's no evidence of a benefit of statins. And I've had people respond to that by saying, well, there's no evidence of statins for someone with a size 12 measured when there's a full moon. This is sort of the reaction to that. I mean, to me, there should always be justification for taking medication. There should be evidence-based data to show that for someone who fits my category, I will benefit from the medication. The benefit is greater than the adverse effects. So you got a lot of people that have good biomarkers. Everything is good. Blood pressure, blood sugar, HDL, triglycerides. Everything is good, except they've got high LDL. And there should be evidence that that person will benefit from a statin. And I'm saying there's an absence of benefits.
Well, especially when we're looking from a standpoint of, okay, look, I have patients, we do it all the time, and say, hey, look, your LDL's running 220, something like that, and let's carb load over the weekend, see what it looks like on Monday. Some Thursday to Monday, they drop their LDL 120 points. It's ridiculous. We see it all the time. You're just changing the energy model, as Dave is talking about. And
Right.
The other thing,
Right.
and he took heat for saying this, but he showed that a lot of these lean mass hyper responders, when they looked at their baseline coronary calcium, they're zero for the most part. And you look and their LDL has been running super high. and you go, okay, these are the people, and then, but you're looking at from the big perspective of where's your insulin, where's your triglycerides, where's your HDL at, and looking at the big picture instead of focusing on that one number, because it's a stamp, it's a rubber stamp, over 100 stamp statin. That's just the way it is. It's one size fits all, and that's the way it is. So that's why when we sit back and say, let's look at your lifestyle, let's look at the whole big picture, then we may have a different answer.
So let me comment on that. First of all, I think the world of Dave Feldman and the research he's doing, I think it's incredibly valuable. And he's working with a physician who's very skeptical of the outcomes. And I saw a comment, which I'm pretty sure came from this person. And his view of what you just said is, this is like taking someone who is healthy and has decided to start smoking, and you're saying, well, look at that. He has no coronary calcium. He hasn't had a heart attack. So therefore, smoking is healthy. This is the view of cardiologists of LDL. LDL is related to smoking, okay? And eventually it will get you. And so this person would demean Dave Feldman's work, even as a person involved in the study, because he's saying LDL doesn't get you now, but it'll get you in 5 years, even though every other marker for these people is good. And that's sort of the way of thinking of the people now following the consensus view.
Well, that's why you need long-term follow-up and following serial coronary calcium, see what develops down time. And that's the whole point of the study. But the point is, these people just didn't get lean mass hyper responders this year. They have it. I think the average, I don't know the exact number. I haven't looked at the study, but it's at least 5 to 7 years prior that they've had these conditions, that their LDL has been elevated, right? This didn't just happen this month and we're getting coronary calcium. They're making a lifestyle change. And that's why I was asking Dave those questions of saying, hey, look, some of these people could have been like my patient who had diabetes for years and years and already had damage, but we never looked at their coronary calcium till now. So if they have a high baseline coronary calcium, we don't know what the cause of that was if they've already made lifestyle changes.
Yeah, I think this gets back to, first, your concern about giving advice to someone saying LDL doesn't really matter, everything else matters far more. And so that's potentially a litigious concern. And again, I started to say this 20 years ago, there really wouldn't have been much able to come to your aid in a court proceeding. You really have so many cardiologists now that are saying that it's wrong. The consensus is wrong. The American Heart Association is financially conflicted. And so there would be great support, I would say, for a physician to say there are biomarkers that matter and biomarkers that don't matter. Now, and again, the LDL, especially when you're looking at, think about this also, people fear LDL-C, LDL cholesterol. Part of the reason why people have been told to fear LDL cholesterol is because there's so many medications and so many treatments that lower total cholesterol, which means they lower total LDL. But realize total LDL is heterogeneous. It's not like there's one thing that's LDL. You guys, of course, know, and there are LDL particles. There are different kinds of LDL particles. And so when you look at the large size, the buoyant LDL particle, there's almost no relation to heart disease. It's the small, dense LDL in which the vast amount of the research has shown there is an association of small, dense LDL to heart disease. Now, can anyone just get high, small, dense LDL independent of everything else? And the answer is no. And this has been known for decades. The small, dense LDL is basically found in a damaged metabolism. What damages metabolism? High blood sugar, being sedentary, being overweight, okay, being hypertensive. So in a sense, you've got this firestorm going on. Metabolism is damaged. You end up with LDL, which has an excess of triglycerides. Okay, it's an abnormal form of LDL. And so that's part of the reason why LDL-C is useless. The other reason why LDL-C is useless is because you've got this cousin to LDL, which is LP little a, okay? Which I'm sure you guys are familiar with this, and people should know that this lipoprotein A is a variant of LDL, and it gets processed along with LDL-C. It's all grouped together when you measure someone's LDL-C. Well, LP little a is an independent risk factor for heart disease. Now, statins do not reduce LP little a. They will reduce total LDL-C, but they have generally very little effect on LP little a. So the reason why I'm going into this is we got to stop talking about LDL-C. And in fact, there's a really nice paper out this past year in which they were able to factor out the LP little a from the total LDL-C. And the conclusion was that the LDL-C alone, independent of LP little a, is not associated with heart disease. So what we need is a sort of a more sophisticated view of the components in the metabolism that are associated with heart disease. And when you factor them out, and you have someone that's on low carb, in which now they're increasing their large buoyant LDL, then what you're finding is, again, no association of the critical biomarkers in the cholesterol components with heart disease.
Well, I think, you know, one thing that I love, the discussion is so helpful for me talking with you too, of your perspective on this, right? And part of it is, okay, if you are making a higher LDL, but it's not in a bad, you think about a kid growing up in a bad neighborhood. If the kid's growing up in a good neighborhood with good parents, they're less likely to get into trouble. But if they're growing up in a bad neighborhood, you want to have less of those bad kids out there. So basically, I think what we're saying here is if you decrease, if you're in a bad environment, you're a diabetic with poorly controlled biomarkers and you're stressed and you have high blood pressure. If we lower that absolute LDL cholesterol coming out, we're going to have less of the small dense LDL.
Right.
Or you could argue saying, well, instead of doing that, why don't we just make the neighborhood nicer, clean up the neighborhood and get the drugs out of the neighborhood, meaning get your metabolic health right. And then if you have more kids, they're not going to be a problem necessarily.
Yeah, get the people on low carb, which I will admit can be difficult for people. There is actually some work showing selective reduction of large buoyant LDL and very little effect on the small dense LDL with statin treatment. And so you're potentially only removing the good kids and you're not actually removing the bad kids from the environment. You're not really changing the whole environment. I actually look at it, you can think of LDL sort of like they're teenagers. And teenagers, you got a subset are troublemakers, and most of them are not troublemakers. Small dense you can think of as the troublemakers. And so what you really want to do is focusing on increasing the overall behavior of the teenagers rather than just reducing the whole population of teenagers.
As a clinical perspective on that, I have a patient, she went on before she came to me, I was looking at all of her history. She went on a low fat diet and a statin drug. And guess what? She has high sugars, high insulin, and she converted from pattern A to pattern B by doing that because she got knocked off all of her good points and all the ones that were left were getting converted over to the bad one because her sugars were running higher. So you go, okay, that didn't make sense. You put her more at risk really when you look at it.
Right. Now, most of the time, you're not going to be looking at the pattern A versus pattern B and the small versus large. I mean, that's not a standard lipid panel. And too often, doctors are just going to look at LDL-C. And, that's been antiquated for decades. Now, we could also talk about some of the newer drugs, which are now in favor. We're talking about, for example, the PCSK9 medications. And what I find interesting, first to make a statement about, so there's an enzyme called PCSK9 that then causes the LDL receptor to degrade. Once it binds to the cholesterol, the receptor brings the LDL into the cell, and then that receptor deteriorates. It's gone. So the cell's got to make more receptors. And the PCSK9 is the enzyme that does that. So the medication now blocks the activity of the PCSK9 enzyme. So what happens is the receptor then returns back to the surface. You're increasing the density of receptors on the surface of the cells, and therefore you have more receptors that are going to grab more LDL, bring it into the cell. And that's why these new drugs can bring down LDL lower than any other medication previously. We don't have long-term studies, but I just think as I said that, think about what it is doing. You're now blocking the normal negative feedback. That PCSK9 is there for a reason. It's there to be able to control the level of LDL receptors. That's what the cell wants to do with PCSK9. You are blocking the negative feedback. You're artificially increasing the receptor density, and you're sucking in the LDL from the blood into the cells. And so cardiologists are just giddy over this because there's almost no LDL in the blood. And it's as if, we haven't made LDL disappear. That LDL has now been crammed into the cells. And I would suggest, and there is not yet evidence for this, but I wouldn't want to do that because I don't think you want to have your cells crammed with too much cholesterol. So that's beginning. That's the thing to be concerned about. Now, just as with statins, we haven't actually talked about relative and absolute risk with the statins, but maybe I should back up and talk about how is it statins reduce heart attacks by 50%. Of course, that's the big selling point of the statins. And if we look, for example, let's take the Crestor study. So Crestor was a study in which Crestor was given to about 20,000 people, placebo versus the drug. And these are relatively healthy people. And when the results of that study are shown, and this is in the paper, this is in the news, Crestor reduced heart attacks by 50%, which is incredibly impressive. So if you're a physician, you can tell your patient you are 50% less likely to have a heart attack when you take Crestor. But if you look at the data, again, like Mr. Fit, almost nobody had a heart attack. 99.3% of the people in that study did not have a heart attack. So how can you reduce heart attacks by 50% when almost nobody had a heart attack? And so about 0.7% of the placebo people had a heart attack, and 0.35% of the people on Crestor had a heart attack. It sounds like I'm not making these numbers up. I mean, it's real. So 0.35 is half of 0.7. So this is how the investigators in the study can say they reduce heart attacks by 50%. But the real reduction that I think should be conveyed to the patient is you have a 99.3% chance of not having a heart attack if you do nothing. And this is what you would say to a jury. If I tell the jury, you have a 99.3% chance of not having a heart attack if you do nothing. Do you want to take this medication in which the adverse effects are real? And if I'm testifying, I could spend all day going over the 50 papers that I cited that show real statin adverse effects. So if you do nothing, there are no adverse effects of that because there's no medication, and you have a 0.7 chance of having a heart attack. If you do something, which is to prescribe a statin, you reduce your chance by 0.35%, but you definitely increase the probability that you'll develop diabetes, as well as cognitive effects, and a whole litany of other adverse effects.
Can I take a second to I want to take a step back in how we think, and maybe none of this evidence that I'm about to tell you I think has great merit on its own, but maybe you can help weave the story here a little bit, or at least how you interpret this data, this collection of data. When we look at the Power of Zero study, and if you're listening, a Power of Zero study was a observational study that looked at people with CAC who are on statin and off a statin. What they found was if you had a zero CAC or a very low CAC, there was no difference. I think they were up to 12 years whether you took a statin or not. So what happens is when the CAC goes up to above 100, particularly above 400, there was a difference in outcomes. Now, I'm not sure exactly what the difference in outcomes is. Maybe they're on aspirin. Maybe they're on, maybe they're getting more care from a cardiologist. I don't know what it is, but there is a difference, and a stark difference in outcomes, where if you have a CAC over 400 and you had an average risk of a cardiac event of roughly 20%, off a statin versus somewhere around 8% on a statin. So I look at this and I think, okay, well, wait a second, maybe there's an effect here. And maybe exactly like you said, it's those people who are actually really, really sick, who have high risks. Then I look at what do statins do? And I can't seem to, besides lowering cholesterol, the only thing I've seen that they do is they make plaques denser. They calcify plaques. I don't see any other. There's some anti-inflammatory effects that have been seen. You mentioned the anticoagulatory effects. But when we look at the level of the plaque, we know that they're taking fibrofatty plaque or really soft plaques, and we make them dense. Now, whether that's a good thing, bad thing, I'm not sure. And then the last thing I see is, the closest thing to good data that I think we have, and even that is, debatable. Certainly, you mentioned the Crestor study, the WASCOP study also showed a very modest, very low mortality benefit that was preserved when the study was done. But the St. Francis Heart study, and I know we've talked about this, showed that those people, when they went back and analyzed it, it was a prospective study that looked at people who got a coronary artery calcium score, and they gave them vitamin C, vitamin D, aspirin, and a statin, and they said, let's see what the outcomes are now. It wasn't statistically significant, but it was like a 400 patient study. So a small study for a small community hospital. St. Francis is like right down the block for me. And for them, you've worked in pharma, so it's hard to do these studies, but they edged on, being statistically significant. So, I'm looking at this and I'm like, okay, who is that person? Like, okay, my arsenal is a pretty crappy arsenal. Like, statins aren't great. We certainly can agree. The side effects, we agree. But if I was going to use it, who's that right person? And so in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, high risk, high CAC, more likely to benefit, low risk, low CAC, no chance of benefit. I mean, am I flawed in my thinking? What would you say as a man of science, the way, is there a flaw in the way I'm interpreting this data?
So first, I really admire that you're reading literature and you're just trying to figure out, what's the best way that I can help my patients. So let's go over that Power of Zero study, which showed that in part, what was important about it was that you have people with incredibly high LDL, and yet they had zero coronary calcium and no events. And the editorial that came along with that study kind of questioned whether we should use LDL alone as an indication that someone's at high risk. And in fact suggested, well, maybe these people don't need to be treated and coronary calcium should take priority over high LDL. So that's the first thing. You covered the paper that was not a randomized controlled trial. It was an observational trial in which you have people followed over a long period of time, some years, and you get the coronary scan test, the CAC, and you've got people ranging from 0 to over 400. All the people were given the opportunity to go on a statin. And this is a military trial, and so they could all go, they're all federal employees, they can go on the statin for free.
Yeah, the
So,
yeah.
right. So cost was not a factor. And I want you to imagine the people whose CAC was over 400, they must have been told, you're at really high risk of having a heart attack. And we're going to give you these statins for free, and they're going to reduce your risk. The vast majority of those people went on a statin, and they did have a lower incidence of coronary events than the people who didn't go on a statin. I want you to imagine what kind of person would refuse to take a statin when the physician says, this is going to save your life, and you've got a coronary score over 400. We don't know what that person was. There are no demographics, and I contacted the author of the study, and I asked him for the demographics, and maybe he didn't have it, and it's not in the paper. But I want you to imagine first what kind of person refuses to go on life-saving medication. My guess is these are people who have a very unhealthy lifestyle. It's more likely
they're eating a Big Mac fries and a Coke, and they're not
they're going to
working
have
out.
Big Mac fries and a Coke, and they smoke, and they're overweight, and they don't give a damn.
So we're just selecting unhealthy people. That's the
the first thing. And these people did have more events than those on a statin. We don't know why they had more events. We do know it's statin versus no statin. So that's what, as you said, we don't know if they're on aspirin. These are people probably refuse all medication.
But it doesn't have an effect when they're a zero score. So there's something else there, right? So
okay.
Yeah.
And that, let's get to the next level. So first thing is, and it's an incredibly important study because it tells us, even with people with high LDL, if you've got zero coronary calcium, and that study showed you would have a low rate of incidence of heart attacks, and that low rate is not reduced by taking statin. And I think that's an incredibly important bit of information. Now, let's just assume for a moment that it really is the statin that's benefiting people with high coronary calcium. And I'm okay with that because it may very well be that it is the what's called pleiotropic effects of the statins that do have a benefit. And it's what was in our paper. If these people have high coronary calcium, we know high coronary calcium is correlated with high blood sugar. Okay? And I actually think it is the hypertension and the high blood sugar that contributes to damage to the arteries. And as a result of that damage, you have increased accumulation of calcium. Just simply makes sense. And by these people taking a statin, they are taking a medication that has some benefit. So it's not like I'm an anti-statin person. I'm a total database kind of person. I want to look at the data and say there are two possibilities. Either these people had a crap lifestyle and that's what killed them, and the ones who went on the statin also had a crap lifestyle and poor metabolism, but the statin benefited them because primarily it's anti-inflammatory and anticoagulant effects. So there can be benefits. Now, that doesn't mean there also aren't the adverse effects. And so I think we have to keep in mind that these people may very well have had the adverse effects. But if you only look at coronary events, there was a benefit.
So would you say, putting them on a baby aspirin would have a significant benefit also?
That's another topic that we could probably talk about for an hour. I think the aspirin literature is very conflicted. People have debated over the years as far as aspirin for primary prevention, and there's essentially no real benefit and there's really harm. Even in secondary prevention, there's clear benefit for aspirin in the first month to 6 months after a heart attack, but I've seen very little evidence of an aspirin benefit over years after a heart attack. So that's actually, there's a lot of controversy as far as aspirin. But again, I look at it that the question is, do you want to do an intervention that blocks the normal physiological response, which is hypercoagulation in response to being diabetic? Or is it better to change the metabolism? So that's why I'm an advocate for choosing an intervention to attack the causal factor rather than trying to block the symptom with medication.
Yeah, I can't agree more. I gotta be honest. It's and sometimes we have to do all of these. That's the hardest part, and those are the tough decisions as a clinician. The zero CAC makes it very easy for me to say, we don't need an intervention. We need a dietary and lifestyle, and you need coaching and a community and support, and you need medical advocacy. Now it gets a little tricky when the risk goes up, and when the risk goes up, as you said, when the triglycerides are high, the HDL is low, if you look at the MESA calculator, those are like the most powerful things there other than age and CAC. So, and that study you mentioned, I don't know if you mentioned this, but I know we've talked about it on social media. They looked at CAC. The only other independent markers they found were blood pressure and HDL, I think, or blood pressure and the components of
blood sugar correlates pretty well.
Yeah.
Resting blood sugar correlates well.
Yeah, so I'm with you, and sometimes we face those hard decisions, like Brian just mentioned, of such a high risk. I mean, maybe this guy had a coronary dissection when he was a kid, and that calcium score is nothing. Maybe he had a Kawasaki, that's resolved now. I it could be anything. We don't know what that is, but we're left with these decisions on who is at high risk and who would benefit from a drug that's been abused by most doctors. And that's
it's a great point you're raising, which is what is really going to predict whether or not your patient will have a coronary event. Now, I've tried to make this argument, and this actually is public, so I can just share with you. This was on Twitter, in which I engaged with John Castelline, who is perhaps the world's leader in seeing LDL as atherogenic and promoting statins and the latest drugs, the PCSK9s. And I pointed out to him the research. We had a whole thread on this. Research showing that elderly FH people don't have more heart attacks than the general population. It was just surprising to me that in the end, his final statement was that all people on with FH should be on a statin, independent of everything else. It doesn't matter whether your coronary score is 0. It doesn't matter what your HDL is. All people with high LDL must be on a statin. And so, he would actually say, you're wrong by saying the coronary calcium is more important. Having a 0 coronary calcium means you don't need to be on a statin, even if you've got high LDL. So he would testify against you if you're a patient had a heart attack with high LDL but 0 coronary calcium. So I understand. I mean, this is a challenging a position to be in.
I think we're actually looking at numbers and not the patients. We're have to look at outcomes, right? So sometimes, as Tro points out a lot, some of these diabetic drugs, the Invocanas of the world, they raise LDL cholesterol, but they lower cardiac risk, and everyone's touting that. So you go, okay, what's the important factor? Is it that you're getting metabolically healthier? You're dropping the insulin, the A1C, and inflammation?
Right. I actually think, Tro, you were saying we agreed at only 90%. I mean, I kind of think we're getting closer to agreeing on everything today, because we're really focusing on the critical markers.
Yeah, I mean,
Hey, Dr. Diamond, I don't think that benefits you.
Oh, no,
I would stick with the 90. With me and Tro, I think sticking at 90 is probably better for your credibility.
Your credibility, yeah.
But I'm actually surprised at how much we agree on. We all look and say, okay, it's a difficult situation. When you're stuck in the middle and it's between us and the patient, and we realize you can't just say, here's a stamp, everyone does the same thing. We have to look at the risk and the benefits, and you point that out of saying, hey, look, we're not even factoring in the risk of the treatment.
Well, when we talk about risk, I also want to say 25 years ago, I applied for that life insurance policy and I got it, and I paid sky high rates, and that life insurance policy just expired and I didn't. So
yeah, that happens that way.
I didn't get my money's worth out of that thing by dying prematurely.
The insurance companies always win.
But I look at it, I've still got, I've still got to deal with the high triglycerides and the HDL issue. It's something that potentially is genetic for me. And I actually am I don't know where I fit with any of the literature, because I've still got that genetic anomaly, and I've got to be very aware of my carb consumption. I've gotten that ratio down to about 4 or 5, which is still, the question is, every other biomarker for me is great. Do I need to be concerned still about having higher triglycerides and relatively low HDL? This is an area I think that has not been studied sufficiently. Someone's got good biomarkers, but is off on one of the lipid markers.
Yeah, a lot of interesting things. I think reflexively, we've done things for triglycerides, and it never really panned out. Lately, there's some
the medications that lower the triglycerides really aren't terribly effective, and medications that raise HDL aren't effective either. And I want to emphasize, I think it's because HDL and triglycerides are simply like the canaries in the coal mine. They're an indicator of poor metabolism, of hypertriglyceridemia, hyperglycemia. If you're not exercising, you're sedentary, you're overweight, you've got high blood sugar, you're going to have high triglycerides and low HDL. The answer is not to take a medication that'll lower your triglycerides and raise HDL. Again, I'm not anti-medication, because I think sometimes the medications, the diabetic medications that lower blood sugar, potentially have value because they're lowering one critical biomarker, which is blood sugar. Not that it's the best thing to do.
And when we do that, it normalizes the triglycerides. So why take gemfibrozil or another drug that it's not helping your outcome?
Right. I'm not actually a strong advocate for the medications to lower blood sugar, because I think there are potentially side effects to be concerned about. But still, that just shows you what biomarker is really important for heart disease. And I think blood sugar really stands up in the forefront.
Well, and there may be another thing, a thing or two about it. What about the effects of stress, anxiety, depression, not sleeping on our overall and cardiac risk? Being a neuroscientist, I think you might know a thing or two about that.
Yeah, so stress is my expertise, and I think one of the primary mechanisms of stress causing harm, you chronically have elevated hypothalamic pituitary adrenal hormones, that excess adrenaline. mean, it directly, within minutes, will stimulate platelet aggregation. And so you're producing clots. When I teach this to people, I want to explain to them, when you get angry or stressed, you are literally making clots. And those clots aren't produced only when you're wounded. Those clots are produced when you get stressed or angry. And that's why stress is so associated with heart disease and stroke. And I also just want to emphasize on that topic, high LDL is not associated with more stroke, but stress is. Why? One of the primary mechanisms is getting those platelets to clump as a result. And it's the adrenaline or epinephrine, as we call it. So epinephrine, ACTH, these are hormones that are released when we get stressed, not only going to increase our blood pressure, increase our blood sugar, and directly trigger coagulation.
Great. Thank you so much. That's so helpful. I mean, because this is the thing we overlook. This is the thing that people just don't get. They'll fight with each other, and even Tro might get upset with people on Twitter every now and again. But I'm trying to really look at that and go, is it worth it? I don't want to have a stroke because someone's.
Yeah, as a parent of 4 teenagers, I certainly went through it, and I had to tell myself, is my daughter staying out all night? Is this worth me getting a heart attack? No. So it's not worth getting angry over some things, even if they're really important. You got to kind of control that stress.
I can't agree more. I wanna close this out with a case, and I want you to give me the last word. I had a patient, 40-year-old male patient, came to me after developing coronary artery disease and an MI. He had some prior tests done that we went through after he came to me like this. He had the MI. He's like, I'm trying to find answers. Nobody will look into it with me. And, we found out that he had aorta calcifications across the aorta on a CAT scan he had for something else 2 years prior. None of his clinicians found it, looked into it. He had roughly 20 family members, first degree, who have had heart attacks or strokes. His grandmother had the most angioplasties in the country that he came from. Many deaths at a young age, 30 years old. And guess what his LDL was?
I would like to believe it was low.
It was about 100. We sent them off for FH testing. We did a 43 gene panel. They all came back. Anything with to do with cholesterol, guess what came back?
I still would like to believe it was low.
It was negative. His FH panel was completely negative.
Negative panel.
Yeah,
maybe total cholesterol below 200.
It was about 200, correct? Yeah, okay. Yeah. HDL tiny bit low. HDL tiny bit low. So he did have one genetic mark. No, all the other markers fairly good. Blood sugar, HDL, LPIR, small LDLP, ferritin, fibrinogen. Couldn't find a thing. Find.
What about the LP little a?
LP little a was good. It was low, less than 75. And
anything out of the ordinary?
Nothing that I saw, and we did a pretty expansive set, but we did a genetic test. One gene came back with a mutation, and it was on endothelial dysfunction. Endothelial dysfunction is the only thing I found. It was a severe gene pool associated with early cardiac death, and it had nothing to do with cholesterol, nothing to do with sugar, completely to do with endothelial. It's the only thing on his labs.
Yeah, that endothelium might be a little important.
Yeah.
What say you?
Well, it sounds like that patient is completely out of the realm of all published research, at least what I'm aware of, and probably what you're aware of.
Yeah.
And so, I take it this person has a low carb diet and good lifestyle, non-smoker.
Yeah, non-smoker, lifelong, knew his genetics, devoted his life to good health, at least the past 10 years, great weight, low carb, great light, great, I'd say put in 99% effort, got back,
a heart attack.
Results. Yeah.
He had the heart attack after being on low carb for a while.
Yeah, he's been incredibly healthy. Real food between paleo and low carb, real food. No, never smoked, didn't drink because he knew what happened. He knew about the curse.
Okay.
And
I feel for you. I
you know,
feel for you, Tro.
well,
The
anyway,
only
the only thing we found mechanistically was endothelial dysfunction, genes on endothelial dysfunction, which I think, comes back to your point. This is not we should not take that LDL centric view. There's much more to it. That
Did
was
you
my
look at his
take,
bone?
but
Did you look at his bone density?
no.
So I do think one commonality is calcium absorption and abnormal calcium absorption. I mean, calcium really belongs in the bones and it gets absorbed into the arteries when you have insufficient vitamin D and K2. And K2 is really kind of hard to come by, depending on your diet. So, and kind of an indicator of low K2 and poor calcium absorption would be low bone density. So I wonder if he's got insufficient K2 or if maybe, supplementing with K2.
Yeah, I think he's on K2 and D3 now. He's on a bunch of stuff now, but it was an interesting case and reaffirmed, I thought, the message in my mind that we have to think beyond LDL.
Yeah, and I really have little to add other than the possibility of it being excessive calcium absorption, maybe because of the impaired endothelial functioning. And so it's too likely then to absorb calcium passively. And so even if he's got, he may be an extreme genetic anomaly that basically has an artery that just sucks up calcium, independent of all other factors.
Yeah, when I went back, I got all the when he came to me, we got all the records since birth, basically, that we could. We did basically pedigree chart, and we got any record we could get, and the only thing we found was some prior calcifications, some minor prior aortic calcifications.
So, yeah, I wish I could be of more value. I would be curious if you do a bone density test.
Yeah.
Or maybe he's actually consuming too much calcium. Maybe you should cut back on dietary sources of calcium. I would target the calcium for him.
I'm definitely gonna think about it. We've sent him to any expert we could find. But listen, thank you so much, Dr. Diamond. This has been an hour and a half. This has been enlightening. Brian, I'll let you close this out, and maybe Dr. Diamond, if somebody wanted to find you, reach you, maybe we can talk just a little bit about what they would do if they were interested in your work or becoming more involved in this sort of work.
Sure. I'm on Twitter almost daily at LDL Skeptic, my username, and my email is ddiamond@usf.edu. People are welcome to contact me. Know that I never give medical advice, so don't ask me in an email, what you should do, because I don't give advice. I give information. You make the decisions yourself.
Yeah, and thank you so much for joining us. It was a great discussion. I've learned a lot, and and as a matter of fact, some of your positions I was actually surprised by, and I in a good way. And so keeping an open mind, I think it says a lot about you as a scientist and as someone who you have a vested interest that you're right. Obviously, betting your life on it. And so a lot of these doctors out there who will criticize you but not even look at your study, at least have an open mind. People listening may think what we're talking about is absolutely insane, but I think part of it's saying, okay, let me apply this to my clinical outcomes. Let me try to learn something, and maybe I just can't stick to this one thing just because I've said it over and over. And I think that's the danger that a lot of these people are in, because they're not looking at metabolic health. They're not looking at all these other factors, mood, energy, stress levels, and all those things. And so, I commend you on that, of having a command, and Tro too, man, just really just knowing the literature and looking at it, saying, I want to do what's best for my patient. Even if Dr. Diamond gets upset with me or Brian gets upset with me, saying, I want to do what's best for my patient, whether it's popular opinion or not. And I think the bigger thing is that I've noticed over the last couple of years is the dangers of censorship, and not saying we have to reevaluate if we're not having good outcomes. We have to reevaluate and look and say, maybe these nutty ideas, we can test them and move forward. So Tro, do you want to close this on anything else?
No, perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Diamond.
Thank you guys so much for inviting me.
Yeah, Dr. Brian, this has been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you both. Greatly appreciate it. And thank you for listening, Patreon supporters.
Bye, guys.